session in our Critical Perspectives on Teaching and Learning series. Quick context, we created the CPTL series about a year ago to give faculty and staff an opportunity to engage with our AU team and also outside experts around topics that are pertinent to the work that you do, particularly thinking about your work in critical ways. And so today we have one of our very own faculty fellows, Dr. Rachel Burke, who's an associate professor of chemistry, who will be moderating a discussion with our featured guests, who she will introduce shortly. Really quickly, this is the first session in our series. We have a few more sessions that you will hear about very soon that will feature some of our other team members. So stay tuned for an announcement very soon around those pieces. Without further ado, I'm going to bring in Dr. Rachel Burks, who can introduce our esteemed speaker for today. And again, thank you very much for being in the community with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. It's so great to see so many colleagues, both from AU, and I recognize some faces from around the country. It's so great to see all of you. Dr. Gannon, and is it okay, Dr. Gannon, if I call you Dr. Gannon, or would you prefer Kevin?
Oh, Kevin is fine, please.
Okay. Kevin is Director of Excellence in Teaching and Learning and a Professor of History at Grandview University in Des Moines, Iowa, home of my undergraduate alma mater. I first became familiar with Kevin's work when I was a visiting assistant professor, scrambling to figure out how to do the job that I was already supposed to be doing. And so his blog, Tattooed Professor, his social media presence, various kind of writings that would appear, in the Chronicle, I just found them really helpful and interacted with him quite early. I sent him an email asking for help. I've always found him to be three things: compassionate, challenging, and generous. And those are the same qualities I would say that are demonstrated in his fantastic book that is making me feel all those Radical Hope, a Teaching Manifesto, and out last year. And as we all know, last year, like this year, has brought so many challenges. And as Dr. Gannon wrote in his abstract, it is understandably tempting for us to yearn getting back to normal. But I think many of us are asking ourselves, what if we could create a new normal that's more inclusive and equitable? And that's what Dr. Gannon and Kevin is to kind of help us explore, dig in. Welcome, Dr. Gannon.
Thanks, Rochelle, for that really kind introduction. And thanks to everybody for being here, for letting me share the space with you all today. Thanks to the folks at American for inviting me to appear with you all today. It's a real honor. And I'm so pleased to see folks have taken a little time out of their day to kind of join in some discussion and some engagement and some thinking about kind of what comes next. So having said that, I'm going to do the awkward transition to the Zoom screen share. And there we go. So the title of the remarks I want to share with you for the first portion of our time together today is the somewhat unwieldy phrase, "Our new normal cannot be the old normal." And I think it's important for me to say right off the bat what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to be a silver linings guy. I'm not going to say that, oh, we've learned so much in COVID that could help us. I mean, we have learned things that could help us go forward, but I'm not going to celebrate, the fact that we had to learn these things during a global pandemic, right? And I'm not going to say that, there's, all we're doing in this particularly unsettled time is trying to, take away, what are our takeaways or some other businessy type buzzword for a post-pandemic world. I don't want to do that. And rather what I hope to do is suggest that there are things that were already in place, structural inequities, lack of access, barriers to student success, both obvious and implicit, both explicit and hidden, that already littered the landscape of higher education before COVID. And so when we think about what happens in whatever a post-COVID landscape for higher education looks like, we can't go back to normal, right? Because that normal was unsustainable for so many of us and for our students. And even for those who could sort of sustainably exist in that place, it was a highly inequitable and challenging set of circumstances. So, what does the new normal look like? And I think it's really important for those of us who are centered in teaching and learning, who are centered in equity and justice in the classroom, to be at the table for this conversation, right? Because somebody's going to tell that story about what the new normal is. And if we don't tell it, somebody else is going to tell it for us. So I think we need to start big when we think about, what this new normal looks like. What does change look like? What are we going to do now? And so let's start with that fundamental question. What are the ends of higher education? What is this enterprise that we're collectively involved in trying to do? What should it do? How do we know if it's doing it or doing it well? Do our students know that the things that we say are important in higher education are the things that they should be treating as important in higher education? So, this question can take us in a number of different directions that challenge, that upset, that maybe bring us a little bit of discomfort when it comes to what our old normal was. So, should higher education be able to give us this? So, this is the Unite the Right rally from Charlottesville in 2017. As a historian of race and racisms in the United States, I think a lot about this picture. And in particular, I think a lot about the man in the front with the white polo shirt, who was a history major at the University of Nevada in Reno at the time that this photograph was taken. So as a historian and as someone who cares deeply about how my field gets reproduced into the next generation of students, should somebody be able to attend an institution of higher education and major in history and then do this and believe that this is the right course of action? To believe that one segment of the global community is inherently superior to all others and that should be established violently if necessary. If somebody can go through higher education or a history major or both, should they be able to and still do this? We are in weird times, and by weird, I mean awful in so many ways. So what do we do with this? What does higher education have to do with what happened on January 6th? If we believe, and I think that we do, that higher education is a fundamental social good, that what we have to offer our larger national community and international community is a set of values, a set of habits of mind, of not just academic competencies, but community competencies, if you will, that would prevent something like this from occurring, that would help us take away the sharp edges of society that express themselves in things like an insurrection. What if we were able to do that? What are the ends of higher education? Have we been meeting those ends? If you look at the current literature, the current discourse of hot takes that surrounds the state of higher education now, you could be forgiven for thinking that we haven't even come close to achieving this larger social good. In fact, what you would see most often in the mainstream discourse about higher education is kind of a collective scoffing or mocking at the very idea that higher education could be an important social and cultural good. That college, as it stands now, needs to be disrupted, that we should take it apart, as Jeffrey Salingo argues, unbind college, take away the resident's life, take away the student support, let students shop for classes online. And if there's a really cool class at Yale that's better than the one at Grandview University, then why shouldn't that student take the one at Yale? As if you could somehow fit all these parts together and have the sum be the equal of the parts, which we know isn't true. And which we also know would lead to a highly stratified system of higher education where the haves would have more and the have-nots wouldn't have anything. But this is what comes to us as innovation. This is the discourse. This is the water in which we're swimming right now. The questioning of the very point of higher education. Why should people even do this? Because, of course, the students that we see in higher education now, this strand of discourse runs, are just snowflakes who can't handle anything that challenges their prior assumptions, who can't handle ideas that make them uncomfortable. So among other things, I think this discourse is perhaps one of the most notable instances of psychological projection we've ever seen, but that's a topic for another day, right? One allegedly serious intellectual has even gone so far as to refer to the college students today as the dumbest generation. So if you think higher education needs fixing, and if you think higher education needs to be either brought to or brought back to some of the things that enable it to be this vital social good, this counterforce to the forces that are tearing apart our society with violence and racism today, then we have to push back against this narrative. We have to reject its very premise entirely. And what we might call that narrative is this idea of, as Henry Giroux, the critical pedagogy educator, writes, we could call this instrumental rationality, right? The idea that education is more transactional than transformational. That the student is a consumer, the student shows up, opens up their head, we pour a whole bunch of content into their head. And after, 4-ish years, there's enough content in there that we give them a degree and then they go get a job. And so the whole point of this enterprise is to move a student through that process as efficiently as possible. And if they get something else out of it, great, right? But what that does, as Giroux argues here, is this instrumental rationality, this transactional mentality, just turns education, whether it's K-12 or higher education, into what he calls a machine that deadens the spirit with the weight of dead time. And so here's a fundamental misalignment that we have in higher education. We sell prospective students on our institutions with some variation of the college experience. We tell students and their families or their households, this is going to be a transformative experience. You should go to college because of all of the things that you'll get. Learning doesn't just happen inside the classroom, right? On and on and on and on. And then they come to us, and more often than not, they get instrumental rationality. We break the promises that we've either explicitly or implicitly made to students. In one way, you could look at this as an expression of the larger ideas of neoliberalism that have completely suffused Western society, if not global society. The financialization of everything, as David Harvey puts it. The idea that something like education should be measured in terms of its efficiencies, of its dollars and cents value, of what is the average salary of your graduates. What are some of the quantifiable metrics to show how much your students have learned, right? We talk about this language all the time in higher education. Sometimes, I'm not saying that quantitative data isn't useful, because it certainly is. But when we judge the entire basis of this enterprise that we're after on stuff like graduation rates, average salary, placement rates, et cetera, we are implicitly reinforcing the idea that this is just a transaction, not a transformation. And that market-based logic, which isn't the sole province of administrators. Anytime that we tell a prospective student, so for example, in my discipline of history, a lot of times we get from students and families who are looking at my university, they'll say, why should we major in history? And what we'll immediately go to is defending our discipline by saying, well, actually, a history degree qualifies you for all sorts of jobs because the research skills and the writing skills you have make you a really marketable candidate, et cetera. And we have surrendered to that discourse by doing that. We have surrendered in terms of packaging an education as a historian solely in terms of marketability and earning power. So this neoliberalism is suffused everywhere. It's like water suffusing a sponge until it's saturated, right? It's every nook and cranny throughout higher education. The financialization, the commodification of everything. And of course, what that leads to is this highly individualized focus. What is higher education doing for me? Not for us, not for the people around me, but for me. It's atomization. And we already have a sort of a hyper-individualistic culture in the United States today, where it becomes nearly impossible for example, political leaders to talk about benefits to the common good in the same way that they might talk about benefits to an individual taxpayer in a certain bracket, right? The idea that something is worth doing because it is good for the whole, as opposed to good for the few, sounds like a foreign language to me. And I would argue that that's because this ethic of atomization, this glorification of individualism, this idea that by default, this is the standard unit of measure, has so thoroughly suffused us that we've lost our way. And in particular, in higher education, I think this is one of the most dangerous trends that we've seen, because atomization, the sundering of ties, or the refusal to even acknowledge the ties that we share with one another, that we should see, leads to stuff like this, where it becomes possible to view other members of the human community not as humans, but as things, as categories, as less than, as an other that needs to be violently erased. So how many of our students experience college this way? How many of our students come to us and encounter a landscape littered with barriers and obstacles and no real good map or set of instructions as to how to navigate those things? How many of our students experience college this way? And if we were honest about our own campuses, could we even answer that question? And would we know how many of our students might be experiencing some aspect of their higher education journey as a space of privilege and prejudice? So many of you are probably familiar with the term hidden curriculum, right? We have our formal curriculum in higher education. You know, here are the classes you take to get a degree in finance, and you know, here's the grade point you must have, and all. You know, in this class, here are the books you're going to read, here are the things you're going to do, right? Like, we have the formal curriculum, but just as powerful, if not more so, is the hidden curriculum. And one way we can define it is the hidden curriculum are these incidental lessons that are learned by students about power and authority, what and whose knowledge is valued, and what and whose knowledge is not valued. And so this is, for example, one of the, you know, how many of our students are coming to college and learning things that we would be horrified to know that we've even started to teach them? How many of our students are learning that their voice doesn't matter? How many of our students are being excluded rather than included? So one concrete example of this, we know from a whole ton of research on class interaction and class engagement and discussion, that all instructors, white male instructors who look like me are the worst at this, but all instructors in a class discussion allow male students to interrupt without consequences much more frequently than female students. That male students participate more than female students at an average rate of about 2 to 1 in a typical class discussion. So what do our female identifying students learn in a class like that? What do our female identifying students learn about whose knowledge is valued and whose isn't, and whose voice gets heard and whose doesn't? All of our campuses, physical and virtual, are teaching and learning spaces. Our students are always learning. They're learning in the online classroom, but they're learning in the student center, the cafeteria, the registrar's office. They are always learning. What are we teaching them? Many of our students come to us with what Walton and Cohen called, in a really interesting and important article over a decade ago, belonging uncertainty. And so if you're familiar with the phrase imposter syndrome, right? If you went to graduate school, you're probably familiar with the phrase imposter syndrome. But what belonging uncertainty is, in terms of an undergraduate experience, is in many ways resembling this larger idea of imposter syndrome. The sense that, you know, I shouldn't be here, right? Like, eventually somebody's going to figure out that I'm here by mistake and they're going to make me leave, right? That everybody else seems to know what they're doing or have gotten the instruction manual and I didn't. Well, how many of our students come to us experiencing some degree of belonging uncertainty? How many of our students were told in high school that they weren't college material, that when they went to ask their guidance counselor about taking the SAT or the ACT, the guidance counselor looked at them and said, have you thought about community college? Have you thought about HVAC certification or welding? How many of our students have been told by their families, if they're first generation, why would you even bother doing this? It costs a lot of money. What is the point? Belonging uncertainty. Students often come to us then with the hypothesis already framed that people like me do not belong here. And then, in what the psychologists tell us is confirmation bias, right? They are very attuned to any piece of evidence that supports that working hypothesis. But the problem for us is that they usually find it. They usually find that confirmation. What are some of the ways in which they find that evidence? What are the barriers to student success at our institutions? Anytime a student stops out, Anytime a student drops out or leaves us, that's mission failure. Because we have made a promise to every student who comes into our doors on our campuses, figuratively or literally, here is what we could do for you. If you could come to the table as well, we will help you succeed. We will give you the environment, the tools, the expertise. We will surround you with the resources that will help you define success however you wish it. But if a student stops out, we have not fulfilled that promise to them. It's mission failure. So what are some of the barriers that explain that? And this is a list that likely resonates with anyone who's worked with students for very long in terms of students who stop out, right? And this is in rough order of, most prevalent to, down the list, but this is the top 10 basically drawn out of the research. But for some of our students, some of these barriers have an especially sharp edge. So for our African American and Black students, for example, these are barriers that have a heightened presence in their collegiate experience. What if we knew more about that as institutions? What if white folks like me at institutions knew about these types of experiences and could do something about it other than craft a really eloquent vision statement? Because what COVID has shown us are things that we might be able to argue should have been seen all along. What can we no longer ignore about students and their learning? So we knew intellectually, for example, when we talk about online learning, we'll say, oh, there's a digital divide and some people in some places don't have access to really good internet, right? Well, last March, all of a sudden, you can't hide from that anymore. It's not somebody else's students, it's y'all's students, it's our students. So what has COVID laid bare? What do we know now that we can no longer ignore? And what are we going to do with that knowledge? So I would argue that if we talk about higher education and the means to which we pursue the ends that we seek, the liberal arts model is one effective way to articulate some of the more important qualities that we should go after. And so the president of Lewis and Clark College in Oregon frames it this way. The values of a liberal arts education compel us to look, to think, and to act beyond our self-interest. Right? And I find that a really interesting way to put it, this idea of compelling us to look, to think, to act beyond our self-interest. Because isn't that the antidote to this atomization, which plagues us today? So that all sounds great in theory, right? But then we look at our job description. Then we look at the things that are happening in COVID that has intensified all of the things that we already have on our plate, all of the things that are already stealing our bandwidth. Not all of this is new, but it is definitely more, right? And again, oh, by the way, this is still happening against the backdrop of a global pandemic. So how do we reconceive the ends of higher education in a systematic, fundamental, and meaningful way with everything that's going on, right? Like just waving my arms around at the entire world, right? Again, global pandemic, enormous social and economic gulfs, an insurrection at the US Capitol 5 weeks ago. Other than that, things are all right. And so I think we can all relate to this backyard cat here, right? The easiest thing for us to do is to howl with all of the angst that occupies our COVID isolated souls right now. But what I would suggest is that we think about things with an ethic of hope. And that may seem really counterintuitive. And I want to be clear that I'm not talking about hope in like the Hallmark card sense, like I have hope. The future will be better just because it's the future. Like, look, I have a PhD in history. Just because time goes on doesn't mean things get better. Like I can give you a lot of counter examples for that. But I do think if we think about hope in a meaningful, substantial way, not just saying I am hopeful for the future, because what that does is that offloads our own responsibility for doing that work, right? We're saying, oh, I know my students will make a better future. No, it's we can make a better future with our students. So how do we think about hope in a meaningful way that doesn't let us take that first available off-ramp? And I think Rebecca Solnit, in her wonderful essay back from 2004 called Hope in the Dark, has a really good way for us to think about this idea of hope in an actionable, meaningful way. Right? Solnit says that hope is not a lottery ticket that you just sit on the sofa and clutch hoping to get lucky, right? Hope is an axe that you break down doors with in an emergency. So very vivid metaphor. You might be thinking of that scene in The Shining where Jack Nicholson comes through the motel room door. But this is, hope as action. And not just action, but morally imperative action. To hope, Solnit says, is to give yourself to the future. And it's that commitment to the future that makes your present inhabitable. That's the part that really resonates with me right now. How do we make our present inhabitable? How do we make it better? By committing to a better future in a way that actually means something, not empty sloganeering, not revising a vision statement. Maybe there's a task force involved, but give them a mandate and resources to do actual work for a change, but commit ourselves to the future. As Paulo Freire, the Brazilian writer and educator, put it, the essential thing for him is this: hope as an ontological need, as in other words, a basic psychic need to make sense of the world, demands an anchoring in practice. So Freire is after this idea of praxis here, our fancy theoretical term, which means simply theory into practice, right? How are we actualizing this philosophical approach? It's one thing for me to say that, we need to act from an ethic of radical hope. Well, what does that look like in 5 sections of Psych 101 that I'm teaching this semester, maybe? Or what does that look like when a student discussion goes off the rails in class, right? How do you act from an ethic of radical hope in an everyday, tangible way? What does that pedagogical praxis look like in operation? And what does it look like during, oh, by the way, a global pandemic? So I think that we answer these questions for ourselves in different ways. But I think that there are broad generalizations that characterize all of our processes, if you will, of answering these questions. Theory gives shape to practice, whether we realize it or not. We act from a theoretical perspective. Our theory is the set of lenses through which we look out at the world and around us and the people within it. And so our lenses are shaping our practice. So our pedagogy, in other words, our theories about teaching and learning, what it looks like, how it works best, what gets in the way of it, right? That pedagogy gives shape to the everyday choices and methods that I use. What language do I use on a syllabus? Do I ask a student for preferred pronouns? Why do I do a land acknowledgement on the first day of class? What is my pedagogical, what's the set of pedagogical lenses that is shaping what seem like fairly simple, everyday, quotidian educational choices? What is the theoretical, the pedagogical stance that informs that? So let me throw a few things out there that might be worth us thinking about in terms of what does our theoretical and pedagogical stance look like or should look like. First and foremost, we need to be creating teaching and learning spaces for human beings. Now, this may sound like an obvious point unless you're teaching robots, but I would argue that we design a lot of classes and a lot of curricula for robots and not for humans. We are not teaching brains on sticks. We are teaching full and complicated human beings. And so we have to realize as we create teaching and learning spaces for the actual human beings that will be occupying them, that learning is both a cognitive and an affective process. You cannot learn, you cannot take intellectual risks if you do not feel safe. You cannot learn, you cannot engage in a learning community if your voice is not heard, or if you are being told that your voice is less important. Let's create learning spaces that, rather than pushing people to the margins, bring them into the center. Let's create spaces that foster meaningful and genuine presence, not just a cognitive presence, but a social presence as well. And in fact, some of what I think the most valuable research is on online teaching and learning talks about various models of presence and community and fully online asynchronous courses, where those things are really hard to build and look a lot different. But I would argue that there's a lot of insights from that idea of presence that could be applied throughout the pedagogical work that we do, regardless of the mode in which we're teaching. So how do we build learning spaces where students are not just cognitively, but socially present, where they are real, complex people engaged in this community, this mutual scholarly enterprise? Well, we need to stop thinking about what we're doing as just covering things. And we're really bad about this in my own discipline of history, right? Like, well, what do you do in this course? Well, I cover the French Revolution. Covering content is something we do, not students. And so the question that we need to ask is, if I say that I'm covering X in a class period or in a course, what are the students doing while I am covering? Right? There is no way to prove that they are learning as I am covering. Simply mentioning something in the same physical space as others does not mean that those other people have learned that thing. So we should design our courses for our students rather than in spite of them. And when I say course design, I mean everything from the learning outcomes all the way down to what am I going to do in the first 5 minutes of class on the first day of week 6, right? It should be for students, not in spite of them. Because fundamental to what we're trying to do in higher education is this perception of students. What are we telling our students? What are we saying to our students? Students are our allies in this, not our adversaries. They want the same things we want. They want to learn. They want to be successful. They want to be challenged. They want to change. They want to be transformed. They may not know what that looks like. They may not recognize it when it's happening at first. They may be uncomfortable during the process, but properly framed and in a space that creates the safety for them to be able to be uncomfortable, they get to the things that we want for them to. But all too often we treat our students as adversaries, mostly because they're the ones that we see the most, right? And our free-floating angst about everything else latches on to the target of convenience. But we need to be very careful about the narrative that we're giving our students. Again, back to this idea of the hidden curriculum. What are we teaching our students? And what are we teaching our students about what we think of them? Right? Students who are experiencing belonging uncertainty have often been given a narrative about themselves as learners. A narrative that doesn't see them as agents of that learning process, that they are passive recipients of this thing. And as soon as that stuff gets too hard and they kind of top out, they're done, right? And if we treat students as adversaries, if we are teaching them that we believe that they have just limited potential, that they won't be successful in this class, that maybe you're not cut out to be a nursing major, that people from schools like yours don't succeed in math the first try. This is a weed out course. Look to your left, look to your right. Only 2 of you will be here at the end of the semester. What are we teaching our students? I would suggest the simple yet radical proposition that our work should be about welcoming students. And you could say, well, yeah, we do that, right? They come to college, they have a whole welcome week, first day of class, welcome students, here's the syllabus, right? Okay, cool. What do we do for, the 3 and, 0.99 years after that? This is our work. Bringing students to the center, not the margins. And this is one of those things that our COVID teaching and learning spaces, our COVID created teaching and learning spaces, if you will, has really brought into sharp relief, right? Because again, what are we saying to our students? We tell students we want them to take ownership of their education, that we want them to take responsibility for their success. We say, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, you are adults and we are going to treat you as adults, right? But do we trust them as adults? Or do we tell our student that we think that given any chance at all, they're going to try to game the system, that that's going to be their natural response? Because when we went online in March, one of the most discouraging things I saw was this all of a sudden a flurry about how am I going to keep cheating on an online test, right? Like, oh shit, Western civilization will collapse if they take an open book exam. What are we telling our students when we use tools that are basically surveillance technology, that are operationalized against some groups even more than others, our students of color in particular. What are we telling our students? We're telling them that, all this stuff we said about, owning the learning process and we're here to help you succeed, all that's out the window, because what we're really telling them now is that we think you're cheaters by nature, that we don't trust you. How much damage are these decisions making? We forget the fundamental insight here, as Sean Michael Morris put it. Students don't come to college to cheat, they come to college to learn. And so as a teacher, if I have academic dishonesty that's occurring, the questions I need to be asking myself are, what's the process that led us to this point? A decision was made. What led to that decision, right? We know from James Lang's research, for example, that super high extrinsic and no intrinsic motivation and a super high stakes versus low stakes things, like that's the perfect storm for academic dishonesty. Well, we could fix those things. We could design better assessments. We could be more transparent. We could give our students opportunities to succeed, scaffolded up to the final thing. We could do that work. And there are thousands of folks who do it every day in their courses. So why aren't we all doing it? Why don't we just trust our students? That seems to me to be a lot easier, for example. And this is just one example, right, of, again, this idea of a hidden curriculum. Those of us even who mean well, when we start fixating on things like how am I going to proctor my exams online, we are damaging everything that we say that we're about. There is a fundamental misalignment between what we say is important and the way that we're actually acting about what's important. So I failed intermediate Latin my first semester of undergraduate. And by fail, I mean like single digits fail. It was bad for many reasons. But I do remember the infinitive form of the word educare from the Latin, which means to draw out, to draw forth. And so, of course, this is the root word of the English word educate. Education is to draw out, to draw forth, whether it's something that's already inside the students or the ability that the students have to master concepts, routines, habits of mind, processes that are beyond their initial understanding. What are we drawing out? What are we drawing forth? We're not drawing forth anything if it's behind a fence. What are we saying to our students? Because our pedagogy is practice, and our practice always derives from theory, whether we admit it or not. How would a fish describe the water in which they swim? How do we describe the theory that suffuses the choices and actions that we make on an everyday basis? And even if we duck that conversation, that doesn't let us off the hook. Everything derives from theory. Your practice derives from theory. If you choose not to think about that theory, then you're not thinking about what that theory is actually producing in reality. As the great philosophical trio put it, Rush put it, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. So what are we choosing? The way I look at it moving into whatever the new normal looks like is that we have a fairly stark choice in front of us. We have a choice of an ethic and a practice based on a fundamental sense of hope for what our students, us, our community members, and higher education as a whole could accomplish to heal such an obviously wounded society in which we live. But we also have the option of hopelessness, which in many ways is the easier choice. And as Freire puts it, when it becomes a program, hopelessness paralyzes us, it immobilizes us. We succumb to fatalism. I've gone down this road a fair amount of times. I have a lot of colleagues who are too. It's a rational choice. It's the easier choice. It's an eminently understandable choice, but it's the choice we have to resist making. Because when it becomes a program, in other words, when it becomes a repeated action, not an occasional diversion, hopelessness makes it impossible to muster what we need, Freire says, for the fierce struggle that will recreate the world. And then while that language may seem overwrought, fierce struggle to recreate the world, sounds like something out of a movie trailer maybe, but that's exactly the work that we are involved in right now. It is exactly the work that we are about. And to do that work, we have to be hopeful, not out of mere stubbornness, but out of an existential imperative. So what does the new normal look like? we have the power to shape at least large parts, if not the whole of that set of structures. We know that structures of inequality and inequity reproduce themselves unless someone intervenes to stop that process of reproduction. So, how are we going to intervene? We know things now that we sort of knew before COVID, but can't avoid now. What are we going to do with that knowledge? How are we going to operationalize hope? How are we going to do this on a daily basis? That's the challenge that lies before us. And that's the way we get to a new normal that is more just, equitable, and sustainable for all of us. Thanks for letting me be here with y'all today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gannon. And I'm sure that there are tons of questions. I hope we get to some of them for sure. We might not get to all, but because I'm the host, I get to ask my questions first, which is yay for me. And so, I'm reading your fantastic book, but also in your talk, that moment when you said, you went online, all of a sudden the conversation became like, how am I going to stop everyone from cheating? And everyone is like running around trying to be a cop, right? And very from ally to adversary, right? So in reading your book too, it sounds like, right, you get to be one or the other. And the conversations that often come up, especially in equity, diversity, inclusion work is, you find people going, yeah, but what about rigor? Mm-hmm. And it's like, so what you're saying is you can either have compassion or rigor, but we need to have both. And you talk about that in your book. And I'm wondering, how do we go from the or mindset to an and mindset?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's fundamental to what we're about, right? And I think the first step in that process is to realize that many of us, at least on the institutional level, have framed it as an either or, and not a both and. And so there's a culture that we're surrounded with, right? Where, we can't talk about, touchy-feely, inclusive stuff, a bunch of hippies sitting in a circle singing Kumbaya. That's not rigorous. That's not challenging. The caricatures we saw a year or two back about things like content or trigger warnings or, the mocking of the ideas of safe spaces. But, anxious and afraid are not synonyms for uncomfortable, as John Warner put it in a really good column. And so we have to ask, what are we doing to promote the real challenging learning? Like, we know, for example, that some of the best student learning comes from failure, comes from adversity, comes from falling short of a particular learning outcome or a goal. But do we give students the opportunity to learn from that failure, or do we just move on, right? A lot of times when we think of rigor, we think of it as, in sort of very weaponized terms, right? So if a student fails in a particular task, the rigorous approach, as it's conventionally defined, is to give them a harder task and expect them to do it twice as fast, right? Like, I mean, that's what we do, and then we call that, hey, if you can't hack higher education, this is college level learning, right? Like, no, it's obviously something that frustrates me a lot, but we do, and I think we've done it so much lately, is because those of us who are teaching, moving to this sort of emergency remote teaching, trying to learn online instruction for those of us who are novices in it, we feel a loss of control over especially the immediate conditions in which we do the work that's so vital to us personally, as well as professionally, teaching, right? Part of our identity. And so in that search for something I can control, maybe that thing is how that test is proctored. I can't control anything else, but damn it, they won't cheat on this test. Or I can't control anything else, but I'm going to make this thing really hard and we're still going to have rigor in my classroom. And again, if learning is both cognitive and affective, and we know that it is, right? Like, we have tons of research that shows us how important that affective dimension is, then we can't have a definition of rigor that just stomps all over the affective part, because that doesn't do anything to show us. We can't assess the story of learning. We can't assess what a student can truly do if all of their cognitive bandwidth is taken up by extraneous anxiety that we are inflicting on them, oftentimes without admitting it. So I think we need to realize, rigor is something that's often weaponized, and rigor. When you say rigor, I think of corpses, right? Rigor is where often learning goes to die. How do we sustain learning in a challenging way, right? I'm not, the opposite of rigor is not dumbing down. And again, so we need to stop seeing things in these binaries. And one of the ways that I would argue in a sort of practical sense that we can make really challenging assignments and ask our students to do really difficult and challenging things is to be very transparent the way we make those assignments and explain the expectations to students and show them what success looks like, not just a well-written paper, but like, here's an example of a well-written paper, right? Like, how do I take something that's abstract and make it tangible for my students? Because then they can rise to things that, none of us might not have thought was possible before. So we need to reframe this idea of rigor. We need to move away from the idea that it's an either or proposition. You could actually be more challenging or rigorous in a course where your students are more fully present with you and not feeling threatened or marginalized. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. I got up on my soapbox.
Do you think too that rigor, I mean, and especially in the sciences, I sometimes suspect that rigor is tossed around to hide the fact that you don't want to do as a teacher anything new.
Right.
You don't want to prepare new slides. You don't want to ask new that, and so, and I'll admit, I'll be like, ooh, because I had a colleague who was doing some real innovative grading that's progressive with revision, which really models how we do research. But the amount of time grading it was that he's like, yeah, it's more.
Yeah.
And then I realized, I was like, oh, so you're saying I'm lazy? No, and I think we can talk about time and things like that, but I feel like, oh, so is my like first clutch to rigor really to hide the fact that I don't want to do anything new.
Right. Well, and it's an easy off ramp, right? Because we can fall back on that because it's such a prevalent part of the discourse around teaching and learning in higher ed that we can say, well, I'm not so sure that method would be as rigorous. And then we've let ourselves off the hook, right? Like we've abdicated our responsibility to be critically.
Like a magic word. Let me just sprinkle in rigor, and that will shut down some of these conversations. I feel like, because then it's like, yeah, but what about rigor? And you're like,
well, and look at the way that it's been weaponized against things like inclusive pedagogy, for example. And that's why I think, especially in our current moment, we need to be super careful about how we talk about rigor, because so often this rigor, traditionally defined, if you will, has been a way to exclude students. If they can't hack it in my survey class, then they shouldn't be in this major. Well, your survey class is a survey, is a 100-level class. Like, why are you weeding out students, right? Like, what is your fundamental purpose in this particular pedagogical space? And sometimes we and I'll include myself in this too, right? We fall back on that idea of rigor as a way to avoid answering, as you suggest, the much harder questions that we ought to be grappling with.
Yeah, and I think when you hear about this and reading your book, which again makes me feel all the feels, because I have a PhD in chemistry, not education, and there are many times in my job where I'm like, wow, I really don't know what I'm doing. I didn't come out with a PhD in chemistry knowing how to be the great educator that I know that I'm like, what am I doing? And so there was something in your book, it was actually a teaching philosophy that is, I believe it's not yetness. And what really struck me in trying to do this work here and elsewhere is that's also a teacher philosophy. And I feel like sometimes, like, I'm trying to be a better teacher. We're all trying to be, that's why we're here. Like, look how many people are here. They're not here because they don't want to be better at their job. But sometimes we're not trained. We don't know. We grew up in that system. And you just get so overwhelmed that you don't know what to do. Do you think it would be a benefit for us to kind of, I bet you a lot of us have that teaching motto of progress, not perfection, growth mindset. But are we really making that for ourselves? And thinking, I have to be a perfect, born from the half shell teacher, or, we'd be better served if we were more like, oh, I get to be not yet as well.
I mean, absolutely. Amy Collier talks about not yetness, where I borrowed the concept from her writing, and it appeals to me, from the student perspective, right? Because that's how we see learning, right? It's the journey, not the destination. We don't, there's an old Far Side cartoon where it's like the man who had learned enough, and it's this guy sitting in an armchair and he just kind of tosses the book away like, I'm done, right? Like we know that that's not what we're about, right? Like you don't get to that end point. But you're absolutely right. Like we are conditioned in graduate school to be the expert, right? Like in my own graduate education, like I became the expert on this very narrow slice of US history of the 19th century. I wrote 400 pages about it in an immensely solitary endeavor in the archives of the writing process. And then I was told to defend my argument against any possible counter argument whatsoever. And then I was hired into academia to work with other people. Like, what could possibly go wrong, right? And so what we do is, we teach often as we were taught. So like when I was a TA, that's what my courses looked like when I first started teaching. So yeah, this ethic of not yetness, like critically reflective teaching, as Stephen Brookfield calls it. How do we do better? We want our students to be doing that process. Why can't we model that process for our students? Now, I will say it's important to realize that positionality matters a lot in here too. I'm a white dude. I can get away with being more vulnerable in front of students about, let's say, a lack of experience with a particular thing. If I was a younger faculty member and a Black woman, for example, when I know that students tend to be more skeptical of the expertise and credentials of faculty of color, that's going to look different. So I want to acknowledge the fact that this is something that's going to be very context specific for us. But I do think that idea of being transparent with students, not fully transparent, but transparent in the sense that like we're all in this thing as a process. I may be at a different point in the process than where you are, but we're all still in this process. And so there are going to be things that don't happen as skillfully as I would like. And, if that occurs or when that occurs, we'll talk about that, we'll learn from it and go forward. And I think especially the way we're teaching now, with, Zoom classrooms and, HighFlex or fully online, like it's such a new landscape for everybody and none of us is negotiating it perfectly. I mean, to me, this is a way to connect with students in that larger sense of, we're all developing, none of us are there yet. And so what that looks like in your own classroom, again, is going to look different than the way it would look in my classroom, perhaps, but that's absolutely the space and the conversations that we need to be in.
Thank you. I've got a question here. So we're going to transition to questions from participants. Feel free to put those into the chat. And we'll try again to get to as many as we can. Please do try to make them questions. And I know that we're very passionate. We have a lot to talk about, but it's a huge block of comment. You're going to see me have to take time to be like, where's the question? Okay, so thank you. I'm going to try to do my best even to summarize with some of these, but one question that's come up is about when students stop out thinking that we failed and that if there's for a good reason for the student, that actually exiting might be best for them at that time again, for a variety of reasons. And is the failure maybe on the barriers that times put up or institutions put up, get back in? Is that much of the exit, but more of the trying to get back in? Is that?
No, that's a great point. And, part of what I suggest when I say, every student who stops out is mission failure, that's intentionally provocative, right? Because I want us to think about it in those terms because again, I do think we are making promises to students when they are admitted to our institution. And if a student stops out, that promise is unfulfilled, by the very nature of the process. And that's not to say that there are things that occur in a student's life that make that the most rational and, effective decision for them at that particular point. I would argue that a lot of times, though, that is the product, the stopping out is the product of a process, the endpoint of a process by which some sort of barrier or factor has intensified and become worse as a result of, either sins of omission or commission, to show my ex-Catholic upbringing. But, that's the process. And so when a student reaches the end of that process and the only choice that makes sense to them is to stop out, then yeah, that is a failure on our part, speaking broadly. And I think if we ask that, I think the important thing is to ask ourselves that question, right? When a student stops out, why did they stop out? What was it in their educational journey that became the barrier or barriers that they couldn't get around? And did we have a part in putting those barriers in front of them? And if so, how are we going to take those down? And so, as you suggest, the restarting part is something that we can be thinking about. A lot of times when students stop out or are academically suspended, they resume their educational journey at another institution. But are there ways that we can think about reaching out to those students and saying, if you're ready, here you can come back, and here are the things that we're going to put in place to help you be more successful. If we pay more attention to some of those sorts of processes, that could be a really, I think, interesting way for us to continue to serve students in a way that we might not traditionally think about.
Thank you. I've got another question, getting us back to rigor and compassion. With alternative assignments and doing that kind of critical work is, and I feel like this would be a question for a lot of us on this call, is how do we do this without burning out?
Yeah, it's, so first we have to acknowledge the fact that, effective teaching and learning and student-centered teaching and learning is a lot of work. And so we have to give ourselves permission to not do all the things, right? Like the temptation a lot of times, and I know I get this, I'll read a book or go to a really cool set of workshops or a conference, and I'll come back and I'll be like, I want to redesign all my classes because all this stuff is great. And it's like, no, the semester starts in 2 weeks. So a lot of where I find a lot of wisdom here is from the folks who do work in universal design for learning. When they're talking to people who are maybe beginning that UDL journey and say, oh, I've got so much I need to fix in this course. And what they'll say is, what's the first place you're going to start? What's your +1? So you're going to change one thing here. What's it going to be, and how are you going to scale that out going forward, right? Like, so we have to give ourselves permission to, not wipe everything down to the foundation and start over, but how to do some remodeling, to use the metaphor a little bit, right? And so we have to realize, just as we wouldn't expect our students to produce a fully polished scholarly journal article after a semester of the methods course, we can't expect ourselves to have the best online course ever, after a semester or two either. And so we have to pick our spots. What is the thing I can do that will have the most impact right away? What is something, where that I get the most bang for my buck? Jim Lang talks about small teaching, right? Like evidence-based things that you could sort of fit right into a class with really not a whole lot of effort or significant change, but are actually going to pay off much bigger dividends for students. So individual activities, a little more low stakes assessment, those sorts of things. So that's where we need, we need to understand, again, this idea of not yetness, right? Like it is a lot of work. And the other thing is, again, self-care, right? Like you can't pour from an empty cup. And academia is a culture that if you let it, will take everything and more from you. You are not a failure to your students if you don't do all the things today, right? Like we are in this very sort of sadomasochistic culture in many ways, and the demands are varied and are numerous. And again, for faculty of color or junior faculty in particular, it's a really tough landscape to navigate, and it will mess with you. So we have to be in a place where we think where we give ourselves permission to do what's manageable, but then we also need to find our people, right? Where are my people? Are they in my department, in my unit? Are they in different offices on campus? Where are the people that are doing this work, that are doing equity work, that are focused on social justice in higher education? Because we need to sustain one another too, right? Because no one does this alone. And we tell our students this too, right? Like no one does this alone. Let's model that for them. But we need to find our people. And we need to make sure that we're in communities that sustain us and don't suck the energy from us like emotional vampires, right? And so the cynics and the hopeless at this point, we got to be very strategic about who and how we're allocating our time with.
I'll put a plug in here because I think it's also a self-care issue, but also getting help. CTRL, you're the director of Center of Teaching Excellence, I'm always surprised how many faculty are like, I go talk to who? is that we have a whole center of experts that will help you. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but also it is an act of self-care because they will be able to look at it and be like, here's the thing, do this one thing. And then, they're like it's a way to cut through. And so putting a plug in to go see, if you don't already, is go utilize those resources. Brian's nodding his head. Brian wants to talk to you. So Sherry would love to see you. So I just look at me just throwing them out there for that. We have a really good question. I currently don't have any teaching assistants, but plenty of folks do. I'm not sure what your experience with teaching assistants is, but how we have been here about how to kind of empower the students to utilize some of these same concepts, even though they lack kind of control over the classes, because they're kind of in this assistant role, is how we could maybe do that.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like, how do we, I think that's part of a larger conversation in some ways about how do we weave more actual pedagogy into our graduate training. As when I TA'd in my PhD work, I graded a lot of stuff, right? But it's like, any pedagogy I got was more by accident than by design. But I think that there are ways for us to do that. And I think what that involves is the faculty member being very intentional about creating community with their TAs. How much can we collaborate? Can we collectively plan some of these labs or discussion sections and model the sorts of things pedagogically that we're after, right? And what that does is the students are getting sort of consistent framing and consistent approaches, whether it's in the main class or in the TA sections as well. So what's the on-ramp for a new graduate student as a TA to get into this sort of thinking about critical pedagogy, for example? Well, the faculty member can help move them into that on-ramp, or the director of graduate studies in a department. Does the department show a commitment to effective teaching and learning and to student success? And is that commitment visible to its graduate students, right? So some of it's cultural as well. But I think, one of the most important things we can do is just, create that model for our TAs, empower our TAs to have a voice in, a collaborative voice in designing the student experience. If they're going to be with our students for a third of the course time, roughly, maybe more by contact hours, that's incredibly important time. Why not allow our TAs to be able to shape that time, but also to help them guide that shaping in that process, so we're getting to a place where pedagogy and student success is centered, where it's happening by design, not by chance.
Thank you. Of course, we love our practical examples. So we've got a great question. I see responses are coming into the chat. Some specific examples of it you've made to help cultivate inclusive courses for humans, just kind of that totality. I'll share one, which is, general chemistry. Anyone who's ever taught general chemistry with the student eval data knows, ooh, man, the hate is real. The struggle is real, but there's just this, the numbers, right? And content is hard. And I remember one data point was, you can cover sometimes all of high school chemistry of a term. So it can be a lot covering data. Looking at the exams, one of the things I did is I let students revise their exams. And they have to, cite their sources and redo the work, open book, open note. That was when it was kind of more quote classical in, and connect it back to class material to get, points back. And it gets back to the rigor is they had to do all that work and go and cite it and I gave them a week to do it. And but again, if it's the rigor is about, when I think about research, we put the in research. It's not one and done. Right. I'm an analytical chemist, man. No, like we were all about those replicants, right? And so that was one thing that I did, and it had a huge impact. But not only that, the students loved it because I do these moments, and they were like, "Oh, yep, very useful." Very loved it so much, and then the feedback was a lot better. But the other thing, point wise, is the average amount of points back. You would be like, for all the work that I made them do, like the average amount of points back was like, I think it was about 8 points. But maybe it was the idea that I'm offering you a chance for growth. And that's what one of the comments ended up being, is that like, oh, super cool, thanks for letting us fix it, like, you know, or something like that. So that's just one idea. And I don't feel that I lost rigor. If anything, I made them do more work, but not the kind of work you were talking about, of almost like, well, then here's a second exam with no, like, no, it was really the same exam. I know. So that's just one example. But in history, what would be in your classes in specific, Kevin, what would be an example?
So, actually, I do one of the things that's been most successful is kind of the same thing with exams. And when I do high stakes assessments, which I don't do traditional exams in all my classes, but when I do, all too often, a failed exam is the end of that conversation, right? And so we talk about, we want our students to have a growth mindset, but we condition them to have a fixed mindset because you failed that exam and that's done. You're never going to get better in that stuff, right? We just sort of assume that, oh, they'll go back and fix it. No, they won't, right? And so I offer my students a chance to earn back points, and they do the same thing, right? Like, look up and tell me where you found the correct information. But the most important part of it is I have them add a couple paragraphs, and I give them a fairly detailed prompt, which is basically, what strategies did you use to prepare for this exam? How effective were they? How effective weren't they? Why did these particular choices not prove effective? And what are the steps you're going to commit to for the next one? Like, I want you coming out of this with a specific action plan, right? Like, so what are the specific things that you're going to do differently for the next exam? And then we're going to circle back around after that next exam and talk about whether those things work, right? Because now learning is process. It isn't just a series of discrete chunks. And so I'm modeling things to students the way that I'm describing them to students, right? This idea of not yetness. And it takes the edge off of anxiety. Test anxiety is a thing. And if you work in a STEM field, students come into your class with having already been told in many cases that they're not good at the particular thing that you're teaching, right? That they're not going to do well, that, they can't do math, right? Like, so the first thing we have to do is find ways to take the sharpest edges off of those anxiety. And one of the biggest sort of relief of tension things that you can do is say, you're going to have a chance, if you don't do as well as you want the first time around, to go back and fix it for credit, right? And that's going to help you building up throughout the class. Like, just that simple act alone, you can almost see kind of an exhaling in the class. The other thing that I would suggest is sort of a particular technique is, I'm a real big fan of the TILT framework, TILT, which is Transparency in Learning and Teaching. The website is tilthighered.com. And it's Marianne Winklemas and her colleague, she was at UNLV at the time, come up with this framework. It's almost a template, which makes many people kind of sketchy. But what it does is it makes us very intentional when we create an assignment or an assessment about, what is the purpose of this? Like, what are you going to get from it? What are the knowledge and the skills you're going to gain? How do you do it? And the TILT framework has this thing about what are all of the steps you need to do this successfully. So, like, go to the library, go to the database, find these journal articles, right? Like, not do research. And then what does success look like? What is the criteria? As specific as we can make it, right? So here's how I'm going to evaluate these things. Here is an example of a successful completion of this task, right? How many of our students come to us knowing what a scholarly research paper looks like, or a book review? Or, in history, I say the word historiography and everyone's like, what the hell is that, right? Like, I have to, what are the tangible examples of success, right? We had to see those to learn them, right? And if we did it, we struggled. And so the TILT framework has this thing, and be very intentional. It's longer assignment sheets, but man, the effort is worth it, because then what you get is you get students who are more invested in the assignment because they understand that they know what they need to do to succeed, right? Peter Felton talks about the idea of hope from a student perspective, where he says hope for a student, in other words, the belief that a better outcome is possible, comes from the combination of agency and pathways. So you have to see yourself as able to bring about that better alternative, that you have agency, but you also need to see what are the pathway or pathways that I can take to do this, right? And so when we give our students a sense of agency and we show at least some of the possible pathways they can take, then we're in business. And then we can do the rigorous, the challenging stuff, because we're giving them a foundation in which that, you know, they could be stretched to do something that might be challenging, and they have the apparatus that they need. We're not telling them to jump over a 12-foot wall by themselves.
And or ourselves. And I want to bring
Yes.
us back as we close out that, you know, we've talked about a lot of things, big concepts, big hopeful concepts, and a lot of work, but it does start with one, and it starts with one action. So what's one change that maybe you could make to an assignment, just as we, you know, yes, I am giving everyone homework. What is that one thing? And maybe it is get the consult. Maybe it is you've already had some good ideas of a small change to an assignment or an assessment that, and I'm not even saying this term, but coming up to think about what's that little bit of action that we can get moving forward. So much to tell. Thank you so much, Kevin, sharing with us. I want everyone to get Radical Hope. It's blows my mind, right? And so really learning a lot, and hope to see Eddie at the rest of our speaking series. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you have a chance, please take the survey that was dropped in the chat. Would really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Really quickly, just some final housekeeping pieces. If we can give a virtual round of applause or in the chat and show some love to our Rachelle and Kevin today for what was a rich discussion. Kevin, one thing in particular you had mentioned around the use of lockdown browsers. Our provost challenged us as a faculty to encourage us to avoid using them just yesterday. We got a message to the campus. So that message was timely and well aligned. A few pieces. I also wanted to acknowledge publicly our co-sponsorship with the ARPC for making this happen as well. So thank you for Malini and her team over in ARPC. And as Rachelle mentioned, if you can fill out the evaluation so we can continue to have events like this, please give us your insights. But again, thank you so much. And stay tuned for, we have 4 more sessions on deck this spring in the CPTL series. So Kevin, again, thank you for joining us and helping us kick it off. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan.